stage 3 analysis. So you've got your selection, your samples, your articles, you've summarized them, you select them, you've gathered, done some initial work. So you need to appropriately analyze them and work at them much more. Now, there are several different approaches to analysis, and this is a section that perhaps will require a lot more time. But in this initial video, what do I mean by analysis? Well, a very, very simple way of doing it is picking up a thread of an argument or an idea in an article and trying to see how that thread develops. That's often a very, very helpful way to both read articles and also to give you the starting point for analysis. But a much simpler overall model for analyzing articles are that an article essentially communicates. So the purpose of any article is to communicate, but what is it communicating? And essentially it's communicating a process and the results of that process. So you need to identify what the process is that that article is all about. And typically what we mean by a process is we see some problem set, some scenario, some situation, okay, in a field, particular field of issues and questions, and you see that the article is about a response or a series of responses to that particular problem set. And the response then details out, and it sometimes has descriptive content of the response. It draws out the implications of that response. It then might argue for the validity of that response, for example. So if the problem set, so a way to approach an analysis of an article is to ask yourself, what is the article's problem or scenario that it's tackling? Not just topic. If it's just a topic, then you're going to find it very difficult to pin it down. If you just say, okay, what's the topic? What does it say about the topic? Too general, it's too vague. It doesn't give you enough sharpness for analysis. If you just do that way in a topic, you will just simply end up being writing a descriptive getting descriptive material out. Yes, it says this, it says that, end of story. That's not enough. To get an analysis, you have to see the article, as a complex series of responses and providing you with the details, the reasoning behind this response, etc., implications for a particular problem set. And as you're dealing with a subject which is technology based, it's always important to keep in mind that the context, the justification at the heart of a particular communicated article in the process is the problem set. Get the problem set clear. So it could be a discussion of the application of a technology. It could be the application and justification for the development of a new conceptual system. It could be the application or the issues related to the process of having tried to implement it and what issues arise. It can appear in many, many different phases across. So you get the problem set and you see this relationship of responses to a problem set as the basis of you extracting the analysis for that article. What is it about? Right? Well, actually, so for example, you might find when you read the abstract, it actually does the work for you. It tells you what the problem set is, and then it tells you what its response is. So you try to detail it out and look at the implications, look at the reasoning process of the response, which will all be included in some way in that particular article. So then you need to tie it to the topic, but not just the research topic, the specific question. So when you're trying to analyze, if this is undirected, if you literally read articles and pick out bits and pieces and try to work things out, it gets very, very difficult to get some coherence. So a much better overall approach is that you see your research question also in the same light. If as early as possible with your research topic, if it's dealing with a technology, for example, or it's dealing with a practice. Now, what do I mean by a practice? I mean something like how to deal with cyber issues, how to train people, for example. That's a practice. That's something that people do. Technology is the tool that feeds into the practice, right? So we're dealing with a territory which these two elements interact. So what we are always looking for when we're looking at the research question is, what is the problem set at the heart of the research question? And then if you set that out for your analysis, then you are looking for what the responses are to that problem set, the reasons behind those responses to that problem set, the justifications for it. So, for example, if we're looking at a new technology or the application of a technology, and the problem set is a problem to do with security, and so a new technology has been developed in order, as a response, in order to solve that problem. Well, you need to be more critical about it. What were the assumptions? Why? What the weaknesses, the strengths of that particular approach, the reasons, the justifications. Also, what are the implications of that technology? Because technology also changes the problem set. It changes the world. Technology does, right? So the problem set is related to, if you like, a world of issues, technological issues and human issues. Technology, as is developed as a response to problems within the world, right? And these are all kinds of things, changes the world itself. So the development of the mobile phone is an obvious. The development of security, two-factor authentication, changes our practices in order to implement a particular technology, right? So it's, if you like, a change in practice, two-factor, and the technology related to allow that to happen are connected. So when you're looking at and analyzing, try to bear in mind these two components, technology and practice, and their interconnection. Human practice, social, but it is human practices we're talking about. Even when you're talking about the development of server farms or automation or algorithms, you are still talking about the impact on human social practices. So a social practice is everything from teaching, learning, going to the supermarket. These are various practices. These are things human beings do. And the link between them provides a world of problems, creates a series of problem sets. Then very logically, the responses to these problem sets are where your research question leads you to. Now, this is very general, but it has applicability to individual cases. When you're looking at, say, a particular problem set, let's say that you're looking at the shortcomings of two-factor authentication. It's a random idea that just popped into my head, probably a fairly useless one. You need to define the problem set. So when you're analyzing the article, you should ask yourself the question, does the article define the problem set, or does it assume a problem and then go on to discuss the response that it's going to describe and analyze for you, right? If it doesn't, then there's a potential weakness in the article, because the article, if it simply assumes stuff, you should spot what it's assuming and whether that's justified. Okay, so another analytical technique is to look at assumptions, but what we actually call the premise. Now, this is probably one of the most powerful ways of analyzing an argument. When you have an argument of a particular subject and someone is trying to convince you of something, and that's true of an article related to technology and so on, and or in a casual conversation, think of it like a chain. An argument sort of works like this. So point number one implies point number two. They string it together to point number three, and therefore we arrive here, right? Point number four. So you get a string of different concepts, ideas, and so on, linked and chained together to form what you call an argument. Okay. Now, any argument that anyone is presenting to you has several weaknesses, always. The first is the very first step, what we call the premise of the argument. What are the starting points for this argument? What question you want to ask when you're analyzing is, what are they assuming? And are they right to assume it? Because if they're not right to assume it, that's a potential weakness in the whole argument, because the first step has a risky element. Because if their conclusion is, therefore we need this technology, for example, right? Or this technology will fail, which might be another example, and they string an argument together, you might notice in the very first assumption they make, they say certain things about human practices. They say that human beings are such and such and they're built like that. Because remember, human practices feeds into the notion of what human nature is. What do we say human nature is? What people do, let's say crudely. And as many students have pointed out, technology can have a huge impact on our practices and our what we might consider our nature, right? The way that we conduct ourselves. So they might be making assumptions and premises about human nature. For example, if someone is describing the need for a particular technology and says human beings are basically selfish, well, that's an assumption. That's not a fact, right? That's a premise of an argument. So that can be a weak point. The other thing to look for is look at the chain of an argument. And sometimes you will find one of the steps that links their argument is very weak. So these are how you start analyzing things. You're not just looking for weakness. You're looking for this idea of an argument. When you go to an article, you hopefully are looking at an argument. Step one of the argument is the problem set. And the initial response to the problem set involves assumptions. Okay, so let's spell that out. So when you're looking at an article and analyzing it, your starting point is to try to work out what the problem set is. The very first thing that you pick out from this problem set are the initial assumptions made in this article. Now, often assumptions are hidden. And they're hidden not because people are trying to cover up their assumptions, but because everyone who reads this particular type of journal article will be agreeing on those assumptions. But that doesn't follow those assumptions are correct. So always look out for what the article says about it. They're the first sets of responses, or the assumptions. Because the assumptions plus the problem set often seem to justify a particular response, right? And you can generalize this and focus in different examples. Problem set could be anything. And remember, the problems are always a mixture of tech and practice, technology and its interconnection to human practices, right? Don't just assume that when you're dealing with technology, you can somehow just analyze everything in purely technological terms. Technology has no meaning unless it's embedded in human practices, unless we're doing stuff with it or it's affecting us in some way. Okay, so these two things always go together. So use those to help you work your analytical approach out. You look at the assumptions, you look at the justifications, and you look for the words which say therefore and so on in order to help you work that out. So I'll stop there because otherwise we will say more about this at a later stage, but it is a very critical part. So let's assume that through the course of this stage, you've analyzed your articles, you've synthesized. So what do we mean when we say synthesize? What we mean is that Article 1, let's find where we were. Article 1 is dealing with this problem set. So what you might find is Article 2 deals with a slightly different one, but Article 3 and 4 both deal with the same problem set or features of the same problem set. If you're synthesizing it, you're finding that common problem set, for example. Then finding that common problem set, you might find there are commonalities in the responses. So you could say that, yes, that response, which these three articles all seem to be echoing, you can draw them together into a single statement. And that's an act of synthesis. That's taking different things and blending them or drawing them together from their common qualities and properties. You've gone through an analysis phase, and how have you written it up? What I would say is that if you started that document, which I said in a previous stage where you wrote summaries, well, a really nice way is to pick out, in the same way, underneath each summary of an article, you pick out key couple of sentences, perhaps, of the article. You make some simple notes, because you'll always remember, if you have limited word count on your writing, you don't want to produce, for your analysis phase, 20,000 words of notes that you then have to boil down to 1,000 words or 2,000 words or whatever the word limit is. you want to keep in mind that the more succinct and sharper and focused you